Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I'd like to welcome you to the last lecture of our Two Great Rebel Armies series, which was conducted as a symposium at the Menger Hotel in San Antonio, Texas in January of 1997. Our last speaker is Steve Woodworth, whom I had previously introduced to you. Steve was making his career at this time off the substantial and robust information that was contained in his first book, which was the publication of his doctoral dissertation, Jefferson Davis and His Generals, and a follow-on book which focused more specifically on Lee and Davis at war, the relationship of Lee in the East. Having already invited him and having heard him talk about a pit of vipers and talking about the West, the relationship in the East was a whole heck of a lot different. And I wanted to see Steve sit back and pick apart a theme about Lee and his leadership juxtaposed with what he had already talked about with the problems of command in the West. And so I asked him to come forward and talk about Lee and his generals and ask the question and answer the question, was he a man of wisdom or was he a man of weakness? I think you'll be impressed and interested and even want to engage on the answer. Sit back, relax, and enjoy our final talk in this series on Lee and his generals, strength or weakness. Thank you. Fighting in the West, and certainly we have also clearly established, at least in the historiographic legacies of the war, that the predominance of interest in the Civil War for many, many years was in fact the relationship and the status of the Army of Northern Virginia and Robert E. Lee. After Steve Woodworth wrote his book, Jefferson Davis and His Generals, which won the Fletcher Pratt Award, he finished a wonderful companion book, which I recently finished reading last month, Davis and Lee at War, in which he has very masterfully woven together the interrelationship between those two challenges of command relations. And this morning he's going to finish what he started yesterday and talk about Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis, etc., etc. Steve Woodworth.
Well, it's good to be back here today. I was telling folks that I'm having a wonderful time at this symposium, and I think if y'all are having half as much fun as I am, Len's not going to have any trouble having great attendance at his events. I appreciate all of y'all being here. I'm enjoying the other speakers immensely, and this is a great thing. Greatest thing since sliced bread. Well, I begin this morning thinking of what my publisher and I discussed as we were getting ready to publish Davis and Lee at War. We started talking about possible title. We were kind of kicking around different ideas for a title. And we started talking about what to have for a subtitle. You notice the book doesn't have a subtitle. But we started talking about what kind of subtitle it had, and the publisher suggested, well, how about something like Failure of Confederate Command in the East? You know, we'd already done Jefferson Davis and His Generals and Failure of Confederate Command in the West. And how about we call this, Davis and Lee at War, Failure of Confederate Command in the East? I said, well, I didn't want to call it that, because they didn't really consider Confederate Command in the East to have been a failure. I looked at it as being pretty successful. And I guess the question is, you start looking at Confederate Command in the East, which is, by no definition can you call it a failure. You've got to call it a success. The question then is, I guess, why was it as successful as it was when the West wasn't? And why wasn't it any more successful? This brings to mind something that Gary Gallagher wrote. He said, the South could have lost the war in the East or in the West. In fact, they did lose it in the West. But they could have won it in the East. And I think if you look at Lee's strategy, that is definitely consistent with the strategy that Lee had. I think you could say, too, that the North could have won the war in the East or in the West. They, in fact, won it in the West. But the North could have lost the war in the East. Kind of interesting to think about what the possibilities were, what the options were for each side in each theater of the war. But you know, a lot, as far as you think of Gary Gallagher's statement, and where could the war have been won for this side, or where could the war have been lost, a lot of that depends on what kind of strategy you're going to follow. And I think that will become a little more clear as I talk about Davis and Lee and two different ways of looking at how you could win this war, two different approaches to the war. Start at the beginning of Confederate command relationships in the East. And we'll look first of all at a period during which Confederate command relationships in the East looked like they might go almost as sour as Confederate command relationships in the West actually did go. It's probably not coincidental that this period features some of the same players as the failed Confederate command situation in the West, namely Pierre G.T. Beauregard and Joseph E. Johnston. Again, men who were not without their talents, men of many fine parts, of considerable military skill. I certainly don't want to be thought of as dismissing either one of them as nitwits or something like that. But men who had serious flaws as military commanders and who had serious problems in their relationship with Davis. Now, one interesting aspect to begin with of the way command relationships are going to work out in the East, we have to keep in mind at all times that the Confederate capital winds up being in the East, winds up being at Richmond. And that's no accident that Davis winds up being right there. Part of the reason for moving the Confederate capital in late May of '61, from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia, is that the South considers Davis at that time its greatest military mind, its greatest military leader. And they deliberately want to put Jefferson Davis close to where they think some of the most crucial fighting is going to be. And although putting the capital in Richmond certainly raised the stakes in Northern Virginia, there's also no denying that there would have been some very tough fighting there anyway. The federal capital was already there. It was already a very obvious prize to Confederates, a very obvious liability of loss to the Union. And Richmond was also a very important city industrially and in terms of prestige for the South. If you want to make a railroad locomotive, if you want to make a large cannon, you're probably going to want to hang on to the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond if you're in the South. Now, the North has any number of places to make that. The South has only one Tredegar Iron Works, really. That's in Richmond. So Richmond is going to be a bone of contention anyway, and you want Davis to be there. And so they do put Davis up there. Now, that makes a lot of difference for the way the war runs in the East. It means whoever's bossing the show in the East is going to have some pros and cons because of that. On the one hand, he's going to have a lot more access to Davis. He's going to have a lot more attention from Davis. He can present his case to Davis more. If he gets along with Davis, whoever commands in the East, if he gets along with Davis, he's going to be able to use this proximity of Davis to get a lion's share of resources, strategic influence, and so forth. On the other hand, whoever commands in the East, if he doesn't get along with Davis, it ain't going to be pretty. Well, that's how it starts out. The first commanders in the East, originally you don't have a unified command in Virginia. The two most important Confederate forces in Virginia in the summer of 1861, one in the Shenandoah Valley, commanded by Joseph E. Johnston. By the time we've got Virginia under Confederate auspices. And the other in eastern Virginia under P.G.T. Beauregard. This remains the case up until the eve of the Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, and at that point Johnston's force, under Davis's orders, is brought over, joins Beauregard for the great victory at Bull Run. Now, theoretically, a great victory ought to leave everybody with a feeling of well-being. Everybody ought to be happy. You won a great victory at Bull Run. The Yankees ran away, and so forth. But of course, it doesn't. In fact, things start to go sour with Confederate command in the east a little before Bull Run, and they really take a turn downward just after Bull Run. The amazing thing is that after this first sour chapter that we're going to go through, they take a distinct upturn. Before Bull Run, there had already begun to be some bickering between Beauregard and Davis about what kind of strategy to pursue. Beauregard, who could come up with some plans that contained elements of brilliance along with elements of total unrealism, was hatching plans to invade the North before the Battle of Manassas, and begging Davis for more troops in order to do that. Turn me loose and I'll do this and I'll do that and I'll do the other. Well, Davis can certainly pick up on the unrealistic aspects of Beauregard's plan, and that's, to Davis, that sort of blocked out any elements of brilliance that might have been in it. And quite frankly, this pre-Bull Run, pre-Manassas plan for invasion of the North was one of Beauregard's more, I think, unrealistic flights of fancy. Anyway, Davis had dismissed that. Well, then the Union attack comes, Manassas, July 21st, 1861, successfully repulsed by Beauregard and Johnston working together. And that afternoon, Davis shows up in person. Here's his factor of Davis being close by. He had hopped a train out of Richmond that morning, and he rode up to the battlefield there at Manassas, moved through the rear areas of the battlefield, and saw some stragglers, thought they were losing the battle. And he calls on the stragglers to rally and follow me back to the field, and we'll win this battle anyway. Well, he gets to the battlefield and come to find out that they have already won the battle substantially. And so there's this little meeting between Beauregard, Johnston, and Davis at Beauregard's headquarters that evening. They've just won the battle, but things are pretty confused, and Davis asks them what they're doing to pursue the enemy. Beauregard explains not a whole lot. Davis, by this time it's 10 o'clock at night, everybody's tired, everybody's exhausted, and Davis says, you ought to be pursuing, and the generals sort of look at him like a calf looking at a new gate. Well, that'll be up to you, Mr. President. Johnston even suggested Davis dictate the order himself. Well, Davis starts out to dictate the order, and then someone points out that the only information I have about where the Union Army is after this battle came from an officer who had a reputation in the old Army for being crazy. And that gives them pause. They think about that, and Davis decides to tone down the order for the pursuit. Well, it turned out it wasn't particularly important, that little episode wasn't particularly important in terms of what actually happened. What really happened wouldn't have been all that much different if Davis had said, I want you to go for them bald-headed right now. Send everybody, and we're going to get them right now. Everybody can walk, goes north, and we chase them. Because in fact, the Union General McDowell did have reserves, fresh reserves, in unbroken units north of Centerville. We were ready to face any Confederate advance. It would have been a night battle, and rarely does any decisive result come from night battle anyway. In other words, it would have been a little shootout in the dark, and nothing much would have come of it. And the next morning, it started pouring down rain, and the Northern Virginia roads dissolved into mud, as you know they were wont to do. And further pursuit would have become pretty much impractical at that point. So they weren't going to get them anyway, and they weren't going to get into Washington, D.C. Where it became significant, though, was for souring relations between Davis, Beauregard, and Johnston. Because there's this great victory, and there's this tremendously raised public expectation. The war's going to be over. We won the war now, we won this great victory. Why don't we go to New York, let alone Washington, D.C.? And nothing happens. And as weeks go by, it becomes apparent not only is the South not going to take Washington, D.C., but this war is going, the North is going to get up a bigger and better attempt to move into Southern territory. And that brings a lot of disappointment, a big feeling in the South that, somehow we fumbled away the fruits of this victory. And that in turn leads to a sort of a game of blame fixing. Whose fault was it that we didn't get them? And Beauregard, Johnston, and Davis sort of get into a very unseemly squabble in letters and sometimes in leaks to the press and so forth as to whose fault it was that nothing came to the Battle of Manassas. Well, matter of fact, it wasn't anybody's fault. They got about as much mileage out of that as they were likely to get in terms of military probability. But That wasn't apparent to everybody, and that quickly sours relations. And it's not helped any when Beauregard wrote a report of the battle in which he mentioned that pre-Manassas, rather unrealistic plan for invading the North, and basically stated that if he had been allowed to go ahead with his plan, why, not only they had had tremendous benefits, well, they would have had more benefits than the battle actually brought. They would have taken Washington and goodness knows what else and had this great victory. And it's too bad that President Davis didn't let us do this. Then somebody in Beauregard's headquarters, of course, maybe this was all without Beauregard's knowledge, of course. I suppose if I were Douglas Southall Freeman, I would suggest that it were accidental. If I were Tom Connolly, I'd say that conniving Beauregard deliberately leaked it to the press. We'll leave that an open question. Anyway, the thing gets into the press, which was illegal. On top of that, by some sort of a foul-up, it gets into the press before it reaches Jefferson Davis's desk. Now, some people would suggest that this was done deliberately with somebody in the War Department who wanted to sour relations between Davis and Beauregard. Well, whatever the case, the first Davis hears about it is someone saying, by the way, have you seen the compendium of Beauregard's report in the newspaper? Beauregard hasn't turned in his report. He can't possibly be in the newspaper. Oh, but it is. And it was. And Davis saw it, and of course, he went ballistic. Here he is being indicted in the press by one of his generals in a supposedly official battle report. Well, that turned things sour between Davis and Beauregard by the fall of 1861. And relations between them were extremely strained. Meanwhile, relations between Davis and Joe Johnston become quite strained. Now, Davis had very high regard for Joseph E. Johnston's military ability. And as I think I mentioned yesterday, it proved to be almost impossible to just get rid of that idea in his head, that Joe Johnston is a great military man if we could just motivate him in the way we need to. Well, at this point, of course, he has very high regard for Johnston, thinks Johnston's going to be very good, and things are going along just wonderfully, and Johnston, as a matter of fact, seems to get along with Davis pretty well. In fact, he's writing letters that could almost be, an unsympathetic person could suggest that these letters show some signs of Johnston sucking up to Davis and just cultivating the man rather shamelessly. You should come here, you're our greatest commander, you should come out here and take command, and all sorts of things like this. Well, this ends abruptly, very, very abruptly. Now, in early September of 61, and I think I may have alluded to this yesterday, I believe I did. It's the rank controversy. Johnston is extremely solicitous about rank. As I mentioned yesterday, he had, on the eve of the Civil War, finagled himself politically because he was a distant cousin to John E. Floyd, who was at that time Secretary of War. Johnston had finagled himself an appointment as Brigadier General, Quartermaster General of the U.S., which carried with it the rank of Brigadier General, staff rank. Confederate law had stated that within one grade, you kept your same relative rank as you had in the U.S. Army. Johnston was a full general, what we call a four-star general today, and therefore he deemed that he should be ranked according to Brigadier General, since he was the only of the 5 Confederates full generals appointed by the time they were actually announced in their order in September of 61. Of the 5 full generals that were announced at that time, Johnston was the only guy who had a rank as high as Brigadier General at that time. However, that was staff rank, and Confederate law stipulated that you're going to command troops, that you're going to hold a line position, your staff rank doesn't count. And so Johnston, overlooking that aspect of the law, is still thinking he should be top-ranking general. When early September, the rankings of the generals come out, and it's Samuel Cooper first, and then Albert Sidney Johnston, and then Robert E. Lee, and then Joe Johnston, and then Beauregard. And Joe Johnston was furious at this, I think especially because of being ranked below Robert E. Lee, because they graduated together from West Point, where Johnston had ranked just a little behind Lee. And throughout their career, since that time, Johnston had very competitive feelings toward Lee. And Johnston had always been just a little bit behind Lee in his promotions, or perhaps they might be just equal. And Johnston had never gotten ahead of Lee until he had finagled that political promotion to Quartermaster General in the Army right before the war. Well, when now he gets the Confederacy thing, finally, I've beaten Lee, I've gotten ahead of him in rank, and now he finds himself outranked by Lee. Just by one slot, but outranked by him nevertheless. And Johnston just couldn't stand it. As I said, he wrote a 15-page abusive letter to Jefferson Davis. Davis responded with a terse letter. At least Davis didn't write an abusive letter back, which I think for Jefferson Davis, this represented quite an exercise in self-control. Because he did, under that kind of provocation, did tend to lose his self-control sometimes, and he would give you a piece of his mind, and rather a big piece at that. In this case, just a few lines, your letter is unbecoming, blah, blah, blah. And that was that. But friendly relations between Davis and Johnston were over from that time. Well, through the fall of 1861, the big question was whether the Confederacy would go on an offensive that fall while the North trained and equipped a much bigger army. Johnston and Beauregard, especially Beauregard, thought the Confederacy should go on an offensive, and they even called Davis to come up there to their headquarters in Northern Virginia and talk about it. Davis went and they did talk about it, and they couldn't come to any agreement. The general said that they would need to be reinforced by 10 or 20,000 men drawn from someplace else in the Confederacy in order to go on the offensive. They felt that that would be better. Now Davis said, well, where would we get these men to go on the offensive? Johnston and Beauregard and their next ranking guy, Gustav W. Smith, they said, well, any place. Pull them from any place. You know, give up whatever. Just, we need to go on the offensive now so we can get the initiative, so we can hit the Yankees before they're ready for us again. And Davis said, well, no, we can't do that. We can't give up someplace else. Now here, you see pretty clearly Davis's approach to the war, what it's going to be. It's been repeated several times during 61, and that is, we're not going to go on risky offensives. No risky offensives. Davis was not, I don't believe that Davis was opposed to offensive action for the sake of appearing not to be aggressive in this war. I don't think that at all. But later on, he does approve offensives, and that particular point doesn't seem to bother him. But I think that Davis's reluctance to go on an offensive was that he did not want to gamble more troops and more resources, in manpower primarily, than the Confederacy could well afford to lose. In other words, Davis will go on a small, limited offensive. He will bet small amounts of manpower, small amounts of resources, in order to throw the enemy off balance, in order to perhaps win some victories that will help to discourage the enemy. But Davis is not going to wager anything that he thinks the South cannot do without. He's not going to want to approve a gamble that will have stakes high enough that if it doesn't pay off, they're going to lose the war quick. He will not go for broke. He will not go on an all or nothing gamble. And this leads us to Davis's basic strategy, which we're going to see repeated throughout the war in Virginia, and that is that the South can win simply by not losing. Davis's approach to the war is the South can win by not losing. All we have to do is outlast the Yankees. We let them beat on us. We let them punch themselves out. We let them come to us and attack us, and we will conserve our forces, husband our resources, not get exposed where we lead with our chin and we're vulnerable to that single knockout blow. And we will outlast them. Okay, that's one potential approach to the war. It's sort of a truism, it's an axiom of military affairs that the defender has an advantage. This is especially true. Some would dispute just how much especially true it was at the time of the Civil War in tactical terms because of those longer range rifles. The fact that you can shoot people further away when they're charging at you, well, maybe so. But even before the longer range rifles, even when everybody was using those smooth bore muskets, it was considered to be a basic fact in military life that the defender has an advantage. So Davis is using that advantage of the defender. I think also Davis's approach to the war, by the way, he never sat down and articulated this strategy. He said, here's my game plan. Here's my strategy for the war. I'm going to write it out right here. Never did that. You can pick it up from dozens of small statements that he makes, dozens of decisions that he makes, like I'm going to prove this, but I won't prove that. We're going to do this, but we're not going to do the other. And you can still sort this out very, very clearly and see this is what he's doing. But I think it's also based on Davis's ideas about the war, Davis's ideas about the Confederacy, and about who they are and what they need to do to win. Davis seems to have had no hesitance about secession. Now we read a lot of people having mixed feelings about secession. Now, the most famous probably is Robert E. Lee. If you visited Arlington, gone through Lee's house, and they tell you, this is the room where they heard Lee pacing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth the whole night long, soul searching before he decides to go with secession. I don't know if it was quite that traumatic decision for Lee, but that's the story that we're told. Davis doesn't seem to have gone through anything like that. In fact, a decade before, nearly before the Civil War, he's saying, I'm a pretty good secessionist. So, yeah, I appreciate the Union, but et cetera, et cetera. Well, he's ready to go into secession. He's really determined to stick with the Confederacy. Davis had this tremendous dedication to the Confederacy. Everybody else gives up. He's still going on. There he is down in Irwinville, Georgia, and everybody has given up by now. And Davis, fleeing on his own there to carry on the war out here in the Trans-Mississippi if he could get here, which he couldn't. So he has this tremendous commitment to the Confederacy. And remember that Davis is the kind of guy who tends to think that everybody else of any intelligence or goodwill is going to think just like he does. So all other Southern people of intelligence and goodwill, he thinks, must share this tremendous commitment to the Confederacy that he has. This feeling that we're just going to stick to the South through thick and thin, no matter what, and ultimately, if we're determined enough, they can't beat us. Sort of like the American Revolution. The British Army runs roughshod, helter-skelter, hither and yon, all across the American colonies. They can go where they want and do what they want. They can do anything except destroy Washington's army, and eventually the British get tired of it and give up and go home. Davis sort of has this approach to the American Revolution. We just survive, we're okay. Now, not everybody has that approach, but that is one possible approach. And some scholars today would probably say that was a good approach, that they should not get so many people killed. I beg your pardon for mentioning the name. I know some people consider it to be a dirty five-letter word, but the name Nolan comes to mind. It's an Alan Nolan of Lee Considered. He spends quite a bit of time trying to indict Lee for getting too many of his people killed. The South couldn't afford this kind of expensive attacks. Nolan would probably approve of this kind of scheme. I think of Grady McWhinney and Attack and Dive. Comes to mind there. They got too many of their people killed, et cetera, et cetera. And was it Robert Toombs, Confederate politician and sometime general who after the war was asked how it was that the South got whipped by the Yankees, and Toombs said, "You didn't whip us, we just wore ourselves out whipping you." Well, maybe there's something, some people would definitely say, hey, this don't risk expensive things, use low-cost tactics and strategy, attack when you have a good chance to really get a bargain, snap up the bargain deals you can in strategy, and otherwise don't do things that are expensive and out-survive them. Maybe that'd be a good strategy. That wasn't the strategy his generals had there. They couldn't agree on that. He would not give them the troops. He went back to Richmond. Beauregard and Johnston were disappointed. Well, Beauregard continued to be a political problem in the East. He, as I mentioned yesterday, leaked things to the press. He leaked things to politicians. So politicians or congressmen are hopping up on the floor of Congress using arguments against the administration that have been fed them by Beauregard. General Beauregard says the administration is not giving him what he wants and this, that, and the other, and this would not do. And so Beauregard was soon on his way to other parts to sow dissension and difficulty there. No, that's a nasty thing to say, sorry about that, all you Beauregard fans. And then Johnston, of course, remained. Now, Johnston stayed in the East right on through to the spring campaign. And we have McClellan's landing in the peninsula, and of course McClellan in the spring of '62 begins to advance up the peninsula towards Richmond. Now, here's an interesting thing. Johnston and Davis theoretically ought to agree about a lot. Because if there ever was anybody who says, let's not do things that will get our people shot, it was Joe Johnston. Let's retreat, let's pull back. Johnston's idea of the ideal battle would be his people entrenched to the eyeballs, and the Union kind of walking up to get shot. That sort of thing. If you could get the enemy to do that, well, this would be a good idea, by the way. But anyway, Johnston and Davis ought to agree a lot, shouldn't they? Except that Davis did want to hold territory. We don't take a lot of risk. We don't want to do a lot of risky offensives, but we need to hold territory because Davis had some political sensitivity. And you can't give away places like Richmond without a fight, at least, without receiving morale damage in the public. It's just ruinous. You can't be doing things like that. So Davis does want to hold territory. Johnston doesn't. And so we have this kind of famous disagreement where Davis and Johnston are disagreeing about what Confederate strategy should be on the peninsula. And Lee, of course, in this case, is siding with Davis. Lee says, we need to hold them right out at the end of the peninsula, fight them the whole way, and we might be able to make something happen. And Johnston says, no, we need to retreat right back to the outskirts of Richmond. Well, Lee prevailed with Davis, and Davis gave Johnston orders, you fight them all the way out there where they are, and you don't retreat back to the outskirts of Richmond. Johnston basically went out there, and in his memoirs he said, what a man, he said that he went out there determined to go through the motions of fighting the Yankees further out in the peninsula, but really, he said, well, we're going to have to retreat back to the outskirts of Richmond, just like I say anyway, and that's exactly what he did. Often retreating precipitately and without telling Davis or allowing adequate time for important ordnance and commissary stores to be removed, and necessitating the abandonment of such things. Johnston winds up in the outskirts of Richmond, and there's supposedly this scene between Davis and Johnston in which Davis, at least according to one witness who was there, tells Johnston, if you don't fight the enemy now, I'm going to remove you and put in somebody who will fight. Of course, a couple of years later, yes, 2 years and some months later, Johnston at the outskirts of Atlanta finds out that Davis will do exactly that. In this case, Johnston fights, initiates the Battle of Seven Pines, or Fair Oaks, as it's also called. The battle is indecisive, except for one important thing, and that is that as dusk falls on this extremely confused, disjointed, and mismanaged battle, the battle is really a sad affair. It doesn't work out at all. And right at the close of the battle, Johnston is wounded by a rifle bullet and some shell fragments, is carried off the field, apparently very badly wounded, and possibly they even are in fear of his life. Davis had been on the battlefield, and in fact, in closing hours of the battle at Seven Pines, Davis had even helped to rally Confederate troops retreating after a failed attack on the Union line. Aiding him were some of his staff, including his top military advisor, Robert E. Lee. Lee and Davis ride back to Richmond together that night, and on the way back to Richmond, Davis makes what may have been his most important command decision in the war. And for all of its faults and for whatever problems may have come from removing this top overall commander, you have to say it's got to be one of the most brilliant strokes any commander-in-chief makes. Davis turns to Lee and tells him, I'm going to place you in command of the Army here, what will later be called the Army of Northern Virginia. Well, anyway, Davis gives the command to Lee. Now, to us, that may seem very obvious. If you've got Robert E. Lee working for you, why haven't you put him in command already? Because at this time, Lee's reputation was not that great, except with people who knew him from the old Army. In the general public, at this time, Lee's reputation was not too great. He had advocated you know, building entrenchments and so forth down in South Carolina, winning himself the derisive title in the newspapers, the King of Spades. He'd gone out to West Virginia to try to, what became West Virginia, to try to put things in order there. He had to work with people like John D. Floyd, et cetera, and Henry Wise. And that was a fiasco. And he wins other names in the press, like Granny Lee, and Granny Lee, well, I think it's another nickname, but I think one of the newspapers said, you know, here's a great campaign that fails because the commanding general is afraid to shed blood. Well, Robert E. Lee, afraid to shed blood? We'll see about that, won't we? But anyway, a lot of people didn't have a lot of confidence in Lee, and Davis's confidence in him was not as great as he later let on. But who are you going to put in command of that army right there? The commanding general, Johnston, is badly wounded. He's out of the picture for a good while to come. Second in command is Gustavus W. Smith, who has been sleepwalking through this entire campaign. In fact, during the most important strategic conference of the campaign, as Lee, Johnston, and Davis had argued it out there in the presidential offices, Smith was literally snoring through the session on a couch in the next room. Not impressive. And when Davis had met with Smith immediately after Johnston's wounding, Smith obviously was not, well, he was outside the loop, let's say. He didn't know what was going on, and he didn't know what to do. He wasn't very impressive. You don't want Smith in command. You go down the chain of command from there, and you might get to James Longstreet, not to take anything away from y'all's friend Longstreet, but he had not had one of his best days of the war. Going blank now, Bill Piston. Even Bill Piston would admit that Seven Pines was not one of the red letter day for Mr. Longstreet. And you don't necessarily want to give a job to him and so on down the line. Who do you appoint to that job? But Davis really has little choice but to look to Lee, whom Davis really considers more of a desk soldier, ironically. In fact, there's an interesting exchange between a couple of staff officers at this time, which may reflect some of the ideas that were being batted around in higher headquarters at this time. And one of them asked the other, it was Porter Alexander, may have asked Ives, at any rate, the one staff sergeant asked the other, well, you know, I know Lee is a great man, and he's a very learned man, and he has a big reputation, but is he going to have the nerve to take the kind of risks that need to be taken to get us out of our present difficulties? And the second fellow, whose eyes turned to him and said, you know, audacity, and this name, does he have the audacity? His name should be Audacity. And so it was. I mean, Lee will take more risks, he says, and bigger than anybody else, and you will live to see it. Well, it turned out to be true. Lee takes command of the Army, and after a few weeks to get things in order, and to get things squared away, begins planning for his campaign to get McClellan out of the Richmond area. But Lee's not just interested in getting McClellan out of the Richmond area. Lee is interested in taking McClellan and his army out of the war. He wants to destroy the Union Army. This becomes pretty apparent from the strategy that he pursues and the risks that he's willing to take in order to carry that out. He tells Davis that McClellan has his army straddled across the Chickahominy River, and he wants to hit the smaller wing of McClellan's army north of the Chickahominy River. For that reason, Lee wants to load up his own left flank north of the Chickahominy with most of his forces, leaving a relatively thin screen between McClellan's main force, which outnumbered him anyway, not too greatly by this time. Confederates had brought in massive reinforcements, but still outnumbered him. Only a thin screen would stand between McClellan's main body and the city of Richmond. And Davis takes a look at this, and I think he must have blanched somewhat. Because that's the idea you get from reading his remarks. He said, well, you know, if McClellan reacts like an engineer officer, McClellan had been an engineer in the old army, so had Lee. If McClellan reacts like an engineer officer, well, this might work, but if he reacts the way I think he should, he'll just forget the problem with you north of the Chickahominy, he'll come straight into Richmond. Lee at first starts to bow up a little bit at this. He said he was not aware that engineer officers were any more prone than others to make mistakes. He was human, But he quickly got control of himself, and he says, well, if you can keep McClellan out of Richmond for a day or two, I think we can deal with him north of Chickahominy. Of course, the victory north of Chickahominy would give Lee very potentially the control of McClellan's supply line back to White House on the Pamunkey River, the Richmond and York River Railroad, and could mean the destruction of McClellan's army. Now, why does Davis let Lee do that? I mean, we're not supposed to take gigantic risks. Well, for one thing, we do have a Union army in the outskirts of Richmond. It may be time when you have to take some risks in order to go on surviving. And two, Lee, we're going to see, is extremely good at dealing with Davis. Because, and this is often overlooked. Look at Lee's strategy, it was very good. His tactics, probably as good as anybody in the Civil War, which isn't saying much. Everybody had problems with tactics then, but he did about as well as anybody. Great strategy, a great general, et cetera, et cetera. But what's often overlooked is that one of the biggest contrasts between Lee and Bragg is that Lee had this incredible knack for dealing with people. And most important, with Jefferson Davis. You look through this first month that Lee is in command of the Army in Virginia now, and whereas Johnson would not communicate with Davis and would not send him dispatches as often as he wanted, drove Davis up the wall. Davis was saying, you know, I need you to communicate fully and freely with me. And Johnson wouldn't do it. Lee is sending these dispatches to Davis regularly, saying things like, well, there's nothing special to report, but I feel that Your Excellency needs to know the complete situation in the Army. Or, I hope Your Excellency will forgive my frequent communication with you. Forgive, yes. His Excellency was in ecstasies. He was just happy. Oh, wonderful, yes. I'm in the loop, finally. I'm relevant. And Davis was feeling very relevant and very good, and Lee they're getting along fabulously. And so already Lee is cultivating him, and Davis likes this. Davis feels that he's being included, so he trusts Lee a lot more. And he's going to show that he's really trusts Lee a lot farther than he would have trusted Beauregard or Johnston. And so Davis allowed Lee to pull a lot more troops out of the rest of the Confederacy, to reinforce the Army of Virginia over to something perhaps over 90,000 men. He allows Lee to go ahead with this extremely audacious strategy that becomes the 7 Days Campaign. And Lee does it. Well, it does not result in the destruction of McClellan's army. A couple of reasons for that. For one thing, Civil War armies are notoriously hard to destroy. Because of the degree of organization that armies have achieved by that time, the degree of articulation into units, armies don't fall apart. Because of the rifle musket, they've got a lot of firepower, a relatively small unit that maintains its cohesion, can cover a relatively big front of roads and so forth, so they're hard to destroy. And then a second reason is that Lee has an adequate staff. And he's trying to do himself, personally, what should be the work of a couple of dozen staff officers. As a result, by the time the end of the 7 Days Battle of Malvern Hill, Lee is exhausted to the point of being ill, asks Longstreet to accompany him that day because he doesn't know what he may, Lee himself may simply have to lay down his command to Longstreet, not becoming too tired to function. And we find him on the day of Malvern Hill actually sleeping under a tree while Davis Lee holds his horse and kind of watches over him there. Davis was on the field most of the 7 days. So Davis shows that he's willing to hold Lee's horse as Lincoln had been willing to hold McClellan's horse. But anyway, it doesn't result in the destruction of McClellan's army. Staff work is not good enough in the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee says, I can't get my orders carried out. And McClellan, for all of his loss of nerve, is somewhat skillful in getting his army out of it. Anyway, they push McClellan one way or another. They induce McClellan to pull his army back down the peninsula and end the immediate threat to Richmond. Now, they immediately face another threat. All through the Peninsula campaign, there had been the possibility that they were going to be hit from the north by somebody coming down through the middle of Virginia. That materializes immediately, or fairly quickly after the 7 days, the appearance of a Union army in northern Virginia under John Pope. Lee, once again, gets Davis to buy into a very audacious plan. leaving relatively few troops to cover the possibility of another Union push up the peninsula. This continues to be something that haunts Davis and other Confederate high-ranking personnel in Richmond. The Union maintains some presence in the peninsula throughout the rest of the war. And at this point, they still have a pretty heavy presence in the peninsula. So what's to stop them coming right up the peninsula and getting Richmond again, just the way McClellan did, if Lee takes the bulk of the army or sends the bulk of the army into northern Virginia? Well, nothing except perhaps Lee's expertise in guessing what his opponent's going to do, which is incredible. That's another one of his great traits. Well, he gets Davis to buy into it. Davis lets him take the army. He sort of complains a little bit. You realize you're leaving us only one division to defend Richmond, but nevertheless, he lets him do it. Earlier during the 7 Days campaign and the preparations for it, Davis had written to his wife, "The stakes are too high to allow one to, whatever, remain calm." The stakes were too high altogether for Davis's liking, but he let Lee do it because of Lee's skill in dealing with him, his skill in persuading Davis. Manipulating is a word that carries perhaps more negative connotation than I want to use here, but in handling Mr. Davis, and because Lee is winning battles, and Davis lets him do it. Well, of course, as Lee perhaps manipulates Jefferson Davis, he also manipulates Mr. John Pope in northern Virginia very handily, makes a fool out of Pope, showing that perhaps his headquarters really were in the saddle. And, you know, that famous quote that Pope says, "My headquarters are going to be in the saddle." I think it was Stonewall Jackson who said he had no fear of a general who had his headquarters where his hindquarters ought to be. Well, at any rate, Lee shows that perhaps Mr. Pope did have his headquarters in the saddle, and drives Pope off with a resounding victory at Second Manassas. Now, after that is where it really gets to one of its most interesting points here, the relationship between Lee and Davis. Lee writes to Davis reporting the Battle of Second Manassas, and he said, "You know, this campaign was a big success, except that I wish we could have carried it out without having a pitched battle with the enemy." Oh, really? Now, Mr. Lee, honestly, the maneuvers that you just went through are such as have to produce a battle with the enemy. I mean, you just turned the enemy's position, and he had to fight you, or else retreat back into the defenses of Washington, when you obviously would have repeated the experiment on him again. So Mr. Lee, how can you say that you didn't mean to have a battle here? Well, I think that Lee was being sort of honest. Lee was an honest man, but he was trying to spin honesty as much as he could. Yes, I think Lee would have liked to have avoided a battle, and he would have been willing to avoid battles with the Union Army endlessly had the Union Army been willing to retreat all the way to Bangor, Maine. And if they wanted to do that, that would be fine with General Lee. On the other hand, the Union Army not being a party to this arrangement, they were likely to fight, and Lee intended to destroy them. He was going for that in the Second Bull Run campaign and Second Manassas campaign, and that's what he wanted to do. But he knows that Davis doesn't want to hear this. He has heard enough complaining from Davis. "You've left us so few troops to cover Richmond. Now, you understand this is a big risk, Mr. Lee." And Lee has caught on. Lee, you know, if he is able to get inside the mind of McClellan and Pope and later Burnside and predict what they're doing, he's much more so able to get inside the mind of Jefferson Davis. And he knows Jefferson Davis does not want to hear, "Well, Mr. President, I'm going for a go-for-broke gamble right here." No, don't want to hear that. But that's what Lee is doing. Well, now Lee goes for one of his neatest gambles of all. He's already well up into northern Virginia at the time of Second Manassas, and so immediately on the heels of this, he marches further north, and as I said yesterday, from about a day's march, about a day away from crossing the Potomac River, he writes Davis a letter that's not going to get to him for 7 days or thereabouts, something like that. He's got to know it's about that long to get there. He says, "If you don't say otherwise, we're going to cross the Potomac River." That crosses the next day. The letter couldn't even got to him by that time. Obviously, Lee knows what he wants to do. He doesn't want to do what Johnston would do and not say anything to Davis. And he doesn't want to do what Beauregard might do and say, "We're going to cross the Potomac River, it's none of your business," or something like that. Maybe Forrest would have done that, I don't know. But he's very genteel, and he wants to be cooperative, but he wants to cross the Potomac River. He wants to go for this big gamble. Now, Davis, at this point, I think is beginning to sense that Lee is slipping the leash here a little bit. Mr. Lee apparently is a little fuzzy on the concept of what we want to do strategy-wise here. And so Davis sends Lee a letter. I'm on my way up. I'll join you in Maryland. And it is amazing how rapidly Lee responds to that. He sends him a letter. Sir, you don't want to come up. Sir, the line is not safe. You're liable to be captured. You're liable to be snapped up by Union cavalry. And just in case that doesn't do the job, Lee sends Walter Taylor, I think one of his most trusted aides, and you go down and meet Mr. Davis on the way up here and dissuade him from coming up to join our lines. Now, I'm sure that Lee did not want Davis to be captured, but I'm also sure that Lee did not want Davis looking over his shoulder during the Antietam campaign, the Sharpsburg campaign. Well, of course, that campaign does not go the way Lee wants it to go. He, again, is looking for, I think he's looking for a good Second Manassas victory on northern soil, hopefully made a little more complete than Second Manassas. And by the way, if that had happened, take a victory somewhat more complete than Second Manassas, occurring in southern Pennsylvania in September of '62. And, well, you might just have foreign recognition by that time. You might just have Britain and France ready to step in by that time. We don't know, but it's sure a reasonable supposition. You can't blame Lee for thinking that's worth the throw of the dice. Didn't work out. The lost orders. McClellan found out what Lee was up to and put Lee in a bad spot there at Sharpsburg. Lee still audaciously gambled for war. Lee could have lost the war in an afternoon by losing his army there at Sharpsburg, but he is willing to stand there on those ridges with his back to the Potomac River and dare McClellan to do his worst. I think he's still hoping to punish McClellan in a defensive battle and then turn the tables. Well, it didn't work, and Lee had to pull back. Davis has not been entirely pleased with this, and yet he has really supported Lee amazingly far. He has gone in for Lee's strategy quite a bit. Well, we come now quickly to the climax of this tension between them. You can see Lee is operating on a different set of strategic assumptions, a different set of assumptions about the Confederacy than Davis is. Lee obviously is not buying into this, we win if we just don't lose. If we hang on long enough, time is on our side. Lee obviously does not believe that time is on the Confederacy side. If the Union has more people, more industry, more money, and more of everything else, then if time goes on, they're going to wear you down. And again, Lee does not explicitly state, here is my game plan for obvious reasons. I think Lee knew what his game plan was. I don't think Davis thought it through. Davis just instinctively followed certain patterns. I think Lee thought it through and knew what he wanted, but was smart enough not to put it down on paper when he knew that wasn't what Davis wanted. But I think Lee believed that we have to win big or we're going to suffer that loss of will that Dr. Hadley talked about, well, he and his colleagues in their book, and he talked about last night. We're going to have that loss of Confederate will. I suspect it has to do with the fact that Lee realized that there was some ambivalence about the whole Confederacy business. Lee, who had gone through some soul searching, some uncertainty, do I go with secession? Do I stay with the Union? I think he was in a position to empathize with a lot of other Southerners for whom the Confederacy might not be the ultimate allegiance. We may, lose everything. We may lose our slaves. We may lose our lives and our homes and everything else, but we'll stick with the Confederacy. And as you can see, that wasn't quite where most Confederates were. They were willing to lose a lot. It's like the fellow that saw the ladies of his town stitching a flag, battle flag for his regiment, that said victory or death. He said, don't put it quite that strong. He said, say victory or get hurt pretty bad. Well, Southerners, and it showed they were willing to get hurt pretty bad. But not everybody was like Jefferson Davis, literally being willing to carry it to the point of victory or death. I think Lee realized that. He realized that especially because the South was going to be called upon, because of its lower resources, it was going to be called upon to suffer a lot more than the North did. I think he realized they had to have a quicker victory. And so Lee repeatedly, at the 7 days, second bull run, in the Antietam campaign, he's going to try to win it all. This is expressed I think, pretty clearly in a letter that Lee writes in January of 1863. Now, this is right on the heels of the Battle of Fredericksburg. You all are Civil War scholars. You all know about the Battle of Fredericksburg and what happens there. It's Marie's Heights and the Confederates behind the stone wall, and E. Porter Alexander telling Longstreet a chicken couldn't live on that field. Once our guns open up on it, and the Yankees just come out there, and Burnside sends them up, they get shot down. It's a butchery, and the Union loses 12,000 men. Lee loses certainly not more than 5,000 and some would say perhaps not that much. At any rate, a great victory for the South. In Jefferson Davis's scheme of the war, in Joe Johnston's scheme of the war, this is the ideal victory. But Lee doesn't think so. And Lee considered Fredericksburg a failure. He considered that a battle that wasn't worth fighting. And this is expressed in a letter that he wrote, interestingly enough, not to Davis, who knew we disagreed, but to Secretary of War Seddon. The goal of the letter was to convince Seddon we've got to mobilize our people more and get more people in uniform and in our army. Why? Because our army is not big enough to follow up on the victories we win. We win a victory, and the victory's a hollow victory, and we don't win the war afterwards because we don't have enough people to follow it up. He said the lives of our soldiers are too precious to waste in battles in which the only damage to the enemy is that which is inflicted on the battlefield, like Fredericksburg. In other words, what he's saying is, it's not worth fighting these battles. We don't have enough people. And by the way, Lincoln saw this too from the other side. Lee is saying, we don't have enough people to go out here and grind it out with the Yankees, even if they do lose 2-1. We're still going to lose. We've got to win quicker than that. That means we've got to win victories that will crush the Union Army. Maybe not destroy the North's power to make war, but destroy the North's will to make war. And as we know, they got close to that sometimes. Well, Lee takes his big chance at Gettysburg. He spends the spring of 1863 writing letters to Davis. He comes to Richmond a couple of times to talk to Davis and the Confederate cabinet, to try to persuade them to allow him to go north. Now, you know, it is interesting to compare the timetable between East and West, and how when we think of the war as being something that happens in Virginia, we think of this as it's 1863, Chancellorsville is in May of 63, sort of the peak of Confederate success. You have to remember, May of 63 is also the Battle of Champions Hill, the defeat of Pemberton. Pemberton's defeated army now flees into Vicksburg and is cut off and stranded there. We get the siege of Vicksburg going on in the second half of May of 63. And so the point is, with all this trouble in the West, with serious difficulties in the West, do you let Lee go for broke? Here's the crux of my argument in a way. If you are going with Davis's policy, we don't go for broke. We don't gamble big. We don't try to win it all on one throw of the dice. You don't let Lee go into Pennsylvania. You don't do it. It's not consistent with that strategy. The South lost the war in the West. Gary Gallagher says they could have won it in the East. They could have won it in the East using Lee's strategy. They could have avoided losing it in the West, perhaps, or they could have, let's say this, they could have maximized their chances of avoiding losing in the West using Davis's policy. That is, if they stuck consistently to it. And thus, troops should have been pulled away from Lee if they're going to go with Davis's policy. Sent out to the West to hold on, not to lose key territory, key, at least for morale, key places. Instead, that's not what they do. They let Lee go into Virginia now, or go into Pennsylvania. Now, if you're going to go with Lee's strategy, we go for broke right now, then you may as well be hanged for a sheep as a lamb. You may as well go ahead and go for it if you're going to go for that strategy. Now, Lee said there are brigades of my army. You know, the Pickett's division had a pre-Gettysburg strength of 5 brigades, not 3. I don't know if we changed the July 3rd assault. Who knows? We probably never will. Corse's brigade never got out of Virginia. Jenkins' brigade was still south of Richmond. Both were brigades assigned to Pickett's division. There were other brigades guarding South Carolina, North Carolina, and Southside Virginia at that time. Now, from Davis's point of view, where you don't risk losing it all, he was taking some pretty fantastic risks to give Lee as many troops as he did and let him go north with those troops. From Lee's perspective, Davis was holding back on the maximum chance they had for making it work at Gettysburg. So what you've got is essentially splitting the difference. You're allowing risks to be taken that are too big to take if you are going to go with this enduring, don't blow it strategy. On the other hand, you are not betting enough to maximize your chances of winning. And we know what happened at Gettysburg. Would a couple more brigades in Pickett's charge have made a difference? Maybe, maybe not. We can argue that one endlessly, we'll never know. The point is, if you're going to follow that strategy of letting somebody go north, fight it out at Gettysburg, you need to give them all the strength you can. So what does this mean ultimately for Davis's handling of his generals in the east? Which Gettysburg becomes the climax. Basically after Gettysburg, and I know in my outline, and I don't know if we got a copy of that or not, but in my outline I had a couple more points. Essentially, after Gettysburg, Lee has to play along more with Davis's strategy to a much greater degree, simply because he doesn't have the resources to do anything else. You get 20-some thousand men shot at Gettysburg, and you can't do some of the things that you would like to do otherwise. But what we see in the East is a story of success, in that no Union Army ever moves through Virginia to attack another Confederate state. Can't say that in Tennessee. And they run right through Tennessee and into, Mississippi and Georgia and so forth. Doesn't happen in Virginia. They hold Virginia, they hold Richmond until things are about over. So you've got success there. But could the success have been greater? Well, I think perhaps it could. Or at least they could have followed policies that, by all odds and by all rights, should have given them a better chance for at least some greater degree of success. And I think they could have gone either way on this. Now, my own choice, we're going to follow Lee's strategy. So really load it up and go for it about as big as you could in late 62 or early 63 and send everybody. But then, I don't know, Bear Spaniel likes the 46 defense anyway. But that would have been my prescription. But I think they could have bettered what they did if they had stuck more consistently with Davis's strategy of not doing expensive things. If Gettysburg doesn't accomplish anything for the South, and it didn't accomplish anything that was worth the price they paid for it, then for goodness sake, don't pay the price. If the Northern Army will be content to sit up there and lick its wounds, well, sit and watch it and be thankful for a couple of months of free existence with no butcher's bill. But go one way or the other. Why did they split the difference? I think you have to look at Lee's tremendous ability to influence Davis and Lee's growing prestige. It would have been very difficult for any commander-in-chief to tell Lee no. It would have been insane for any commander-in-chief to forego the use of the talents of a Robert E. Lee. God has given you this incredible talent, so you have to use it someplace. But how? Lee was very influential with Davis, and then Davis, and here's where his irresoluteness comes in. Davis could sometimes, under extreme pressure, get a little irresolute. Maybe it was the politician coming out in him, the man that wants to split the difference. They said once Franklin Delano Roosevelt was talking to advisors, two different advisors who were advocating diametrically opposite and mutually exclusive courses of action. And Roosevelt said, well, can't you bring me a recommendation that combines these both? Maybe the politician's way to deal with things, I don't know, and maybe that's what Jefferson Davis was doing in splitting the difference. Well, I'll let you have this many troops, but I won't let you have more. Perhaps, in any case, the influence of Lee, coupled with the irresoluteness of Davis, or the unwillingness of Davis to go ruthlessly for one strategy or the other, causes them to split the difference. It doesn't result in final failure in the East because of the considerable talents of Davis and the even more considerable talents of Lee. But it doesn't allow them to, I think, maximize the chances they would have had for success. Okay, are there any questions?
Certainly there are questions.
Yes.
I don't know if you've ever heard of Stanley Cooper. I mean, if he was the highest ranking officer, if he was too old, just didn't care.
He was old and he was, as they put it in those days, a cipher. He just was a first-rate clerk. He was a paper shoveler and a pencil pusher, and that was really all he was good for. And Davis came to realize that pretty quickly. He becomes a big fat zero. Just because, partially his age, but it wouldn't even have to be his age. He wasn't all that much older than Lee, but that's who he was. He was a bureaucrat.
Sort of Henry Halleck of the Confederacy.
Yeah, first-rate clerk.
Well, he did the same thing in the old army.
Mhm.
And of course, he learned from one of the greatest pencil pushers ever, Roger Jones. Roger Jones was adjutant general of the army forever.
Well, yeah, Cooper definitely continued his activities from the old army. It was same thing going right on.
Steve,
Yes.
do you get the impression that Lee was incredibly lucky to survive the 7 days?
Survived it physically, personally, or?
No, I mean that the Army survived. I mean, given Jackson's performance.
I don't tend to think that Jackson's performance was as bad as all that. Lee did not tend to tolerate lousy performances from his subordinates. Magruder messes up, not all that badly, but he doesn't quite come up to the mark in the 7 days, and Magruder is on his way west. Eugene is on his way west. D.H. Hill, after Antietam, is shelved to North Carolina. I don't think Lee would have tolerated Jackson if Jackson had muffed Lee's plans as badly and inexcusably as we're sometimes led to believe. I also look at the fact that it was basically Jackson's presence out there on the flank that caused McClellan to abandon the positions there at Mechanicsville and Holston Swamp and so forth. That causes him to fall back there. And I don't believe, well, aside from just the presence of any resolute enemy, which seems to cause McClellan to fall back. But primarily Jackson's presence out there drives McClellan back, which is what gives Lee the opportunity to really tear at McClellan and do most of the damage that he does do. It didn't work quite the way Lee wanted, but I don't think Jackson's performance is all that bad. Lucky? Not exactly lucky. Now, if Ulysses S. Grant had been commanding there in the 7 days, you can imagine what would happen. Lee flings his people at the Union lines of Mechanicsville. They beat them off. Perhaps it would have been Fitz-John Porter, although it wouldn't have been Fitz-John Porter if Grant was in the east, but say Fitz-John Porter goes to Grant, and you picture the scene, and Fitz-John Porter says, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own time today." Grant says, "Yeah, look him tomorrow, though." And Grant wouldn't have pulled back. I think Grant would have done exactly what Davis feared, and Grant would have pushed on the whole front and found out how weak the lines were in front of Richmond. But Lee would not have been doing that if Grant were there. Lee has this amazing ability to figure out the guy that he's working against. He once said to somebody that he changes commanders. I'm afraid they're going to get somebody in here that I don't understand. Well, he never did. He even understood Grant. Now, he never got the better of Grant, but he understood that there were some things you don't do with Mr. Grant in front of you, and that was one of them. So I would say it's not luck because he had McClellan pegged. He knew what to expect from McClellan, and McClellan performed about as Lee expected. Yes?
Could you comment just a little on Magruder's shortcomings there, and then I'd like to hear Lynn comment on your comments.
Well, I don't really feel that Magruder's shortcomings were that bad. I feel they were more staff shortcomings. I think that Magruder got garbled orders. I'm not an expert on Magruder and the 7 days thing per se, but my general feeling about it is that it was a problem of staff, and that Magruder wasn't giving the best of orders. And I don't know if his performance was just absolutely, positively stellar, but I don't think it was much worse than could be expected under the circumstances.
Well, without discussing this in terms of a referendum. And incidentally, that's kind of a loaded question for those of you who don't know this situation. Mike Settlesback is a professor at San Antonio College. He and I are co-authoring a biography on John Magruder that we have sent to UNC Press, and we're revising right now, which Paul Castorp's recent biography just redoubled our efforts because it's really a pretty poor piece of work. What we're talking about relative to Magruder is the background, without being lengthy about it, is Magruder is a fairly important, fairly significant person within the context of the state of Virginia early on in the war. He's made the third-ranking officer in the Virginia forces and is given the responsibility of anchoring down the peninsula line, of which there are two significant problems there. The first is the defense of Richmond, which is not the primary reason. The primary reason for McClellan holding the lower peninsula is the activity in the Gosport Naval Shipyard, which is not just the restructuring of Virginia, but also the construction of a Confederate Navy and an opportunity for a Confederate Navy. And there's a great deal of controversy because, of course, as you lead into Joe Johnston and you talk about his shortcomings, there's a very volatile discussion that occurs in Richmond over what Johnson is to do, and when he brings his forces down, and one of those instructions is to hold the peninsula. Undoubtedly, he's told of the strategic requirements with Gosport, which he does not execute and gets him a great deal of difficulty. Magruder, when Johnston comes down, when the primary forces are joined into what is to be the Army of Northern Virginia, the command structure puts Johnston in command. His number two in command is Gustavus Smith, who is widely despised for his tardy arrival into the Confederate force, in the Confederate service. And Magruder is made subordinate to Smith in the retreat up the peninsula, and there is so much friction there that Magruder asked George Randolph, who had been his artillery officer on the peninsula, he says, "I want out of here." He turns down the offer of a command in Chattanooga. We've seen that correspondence. He does, in fact, accept a departmental command for the Trans-Mississippi Department, and he's ready to go take that. His problem is that he's a Virginian, there are forces moving up the peninsula, and he asks for a deferral of his orders. He spends the entire time leading up to the execution of the 7 days doing Trans-Mississippi departmental activities, and so consequently, when the battles are joined around Richmond, he is transferred. I've gotten this out of order. He receives his command for the Trans-Mississippi, asks to have it deferred, and then while it is deferred, he is also working on preparing to move to the Trans-Mississippi. The 7 days takes place. There is still some animosity between Johnston and Smith. They're now out of the picture. Magruder is given a fairly important responsibility there, which is to hold the smaller force in the presence of McClellan while Lee executes his turning movement. Magruder is accused of allowing the Federals to get out in front of him and get away from him without identifying it. He goes to Savage Station, executes a fairly weak attack against Vosges Sumner and 2.5 Federal Corps that are holding Savage Station. He is chastised by Lee, probably unjustly. Magruder has health problems, and so Magruder goes to Malvern Hill, fresh with the stinging rebuke of Lee in his ears, and even Douglas Southall Freeman mentions this in his book when the disaster at Malvern Hill occurs. Lee comes up to Magruder and says, "General, why did you attack?" And he says, "In obedience to your orders twice repeated," which is a fairly serious indictment, even in Freeman's eyes, because Freeman never said anything bad about Lee, and in this case, he says Lee just lowered his eyes and walked away. Magruder the next day just asks to leave. He's ready to go, and he is allowed to leave. And there's a tremendous story that goes on beyond that, which has more or less been buried in the archives, but it has come out. We have found that there's a lot of duplicity in getting him here to Texas, and it finally comes to technical compromise maneuver to restore his reputation. But that is, I think, many of the others were shuffled specifically because of very poor performance. We have concluded we don't think that Magruder specifically was shuffled for bad performance in 7 days. It was too close on the heels of what had happened. But we do think that in the long he has more or less been covered by the general aura and the thoughts that Lee was getting rid of people he didn't want, which leads to my question to you, which is basically what is your take on, instead of a thesis that Lee got rid of incompetent major generals, what would be your take on the thesis that Lee was actually seeking to put a generational issue with his corps commanders, that instead of keeping a lot of contemporaries, people who perhaps were his contemporaries, that he in fact went for different generational leaders, and that was the real reason for moving people out of his army?
Well, I haven't thought of that much before, but I don't think I would be inclined to go for that. I think that I don't see anywhere, I haven't seen anywhere in Lee's correspondence where he suggested that the age of the guy was a big factor, unless it be the guy who couldn't do his job. So I know, I was thinking, Lee references to youth of the commander, and one thing that comes to mind is after Chancellorsville, Lee, who by the way was going to destroy Hooker's army there, he wanted to go for the whole enchilada there. Had to go, Hooker is backed up, he was back to the Rapidan there in entrenchments, and Lee wants to assault, and Hooker pulls out before Lee can assault. The assault, it's hard to imagine, it probably would have been a terrible bloodletting, and when they get away, I think is it Rhodes or Pender, one of them comes to Lee and tells him, well, they pulled back, sir, they're not there anymore. And he says, that's what you young men always do. You let them get away. Get after them. So perhaps he felt like the young men weren't doing such a good job. I don't know, but I'm not come across it with these things. It's a generational thing.
Steve?
Yeah.
In regard to Davis's strategy, two things. Davis knew the numbers about the North resources and the South resources. Davis also knew the inclination of Southerners, and that wasn't basically to sit back on the defensive. They wanted to attack. They had a great deal of contempt for the North. How did he blend these things into that strategy?
Well, both Davis and Lee, I think, were equally aware of the disparity in numbers, wealth, manufacturing power, and so forth between North and South. I think that their different approaches to the war were simply different responses to that. Here's the situation we face now. What are we going to do about it? And I think Davis, and I don't know that Davis ever articulates it this clearly, even to himself. But I think Davis's response was, we have to husband our resources. We have to be very conservative. We have to not take risks and not spend our forces. And Lee just had a different response to that. I think that part of understanding possible inconsistencies in Davis's approach were that he did not ever write it down. And by the way, I think he probably should have at least called in and briefed his generals. This is our game plan. This is the way we're going to pursue the war. This is going to be our strategy. I think it would have helped him in his own thought just to go through that exercise. Now, as far as the Southern people being very aggressive-minded and wanting to attack, yes, Davis knew that, and so he responded to this by calling for the offensive defensive. Okay? If they come across and get us, we'll hit them. If they make any moves, we will attack. He also sometimes would use somewhat offensive-sounding rhetoric. We're ready to carry the war to them. If we had had the weapons that we thought we were going to have, we'd be contending now on the banks of the Susquehanna instead of the banks of the Rappahannock, etc. But when it comes to action, what type of operation will he authorize? He won't authorize a northern invasion or an offensive movement unless he either feels that it is absolutely necessary, like the offensive outside Richmond, or he feels that it's got a real good cost-benefit probability sort of a layout that, this is not likely to risk very much, and we can get some, basically it's a bargain deal. We can get some little results here at not much cost. Or unless he is extremely influenced by Lee and is sort of going along with something against his better judgment. So, yeah, he'll talk kind of offensively to placate the people. He will try to placate the people with limited offenses and small operations. See, we are hitting the enemy. But he's not really, when push comes to shove, it's a matter of action, going to go ahead and load all those eggs into that basket and send it out there.
But Getty was willing to roll the dice with Lee at Antietam and Gettysburg, which was a great gamble.
Well, he was, I don't know about willing, he was persuaded rather reluctantly. He was prevailed upon by Lee.
But the bottom line is he made the decision to let Lee go forward. Whether you say it's willing or unwilling, he's accountable for that.
Well, he's accountable. Right, exactly. He's accountable, and that's just it. He is accountable. He should have asserted himself in war. And at Antietam, I mean, he didn't have anything to say about Lee crossing the Potomac. First thing that Davis hears about, maybe I'll go across the Potomac. By that time, Lee is across the Potomac. Ben Davis says, I'm going to come and join you. And Lee says, don't, you can't. The Yankees will get you. So Davis, on the whole, doesn't have a whole lot to say about the Antietam campaign. He really doesn't give his consent to that. He gives consent to the Gettysburg campaign, but Lee has advertised it to him as a little spoiling operation. Let's go north of Potomac and get some shoes and corn and hogs and wheat and other good stuff that we want, and take the war out of Virginia and throw the Yankees off their balance. And with any luck, why, we'll get back without having a battle. Yeah, sure you will.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's not going to happen. The Yankees aren't going to let him go.
If you go north of Potomac, they're going to come looking for you. They have to politically. But it's another one of those things of oh sure, you like say, yeah, I'm going to go north of the Potomac, and I would like it if the Yankees wouldn't attack me. Yeah, I mean, yeah, we all would, you know. Yeah, I mean, all the Confederates would like it if the Yankees would just stay north of the Mason-Dixon line, but they aren't going to do that. So it is billed to Davis a little bit differently than what Lee's really going for. And then Davis, in approving it, is, in Gettysburg, I think is the clearest case, it is acquiescing in a strategy that he doesn't really feel comfortable with. This isn't really his strategy, but I'll let you do this because you're Robert E. Lee and because you have this tremendous reputation, because I really like you and you really are good at persuading me. I will let you do this, but I'm going to hedge my bets here a little bit by holding back a couple of brigades here and a couple of brigades there, and not really going whole hog.
Do you think Lee was disingenuous in writing about the Gettysburg campaign afterwards? Because he's sort of talking about, well, I really didn't want to have a battle up there.
Well, close. Again, it's not, the statements I think that Lee made were not strictly false. I mean, I don't think you can find Lee saying a blatant falsehood. I think that is not true. But you can find Lee saying not the full truth. It's wonderful. We really accomplished all this good stuff, which was getting supplies and getting the Yankees out of Virginia for a while. And that was what I wanted to accomplish. Well, yeah, he wanted to accomplish that, yes, but he also had some other ideas in mind.
What about relieving Vicksburg?
Lee?
Yeah, about going to Gettysburg.
Well, I don't think that he was thinking of relieving Vicksburg except in the biggest sense of possibly breaking Northern morale in such a way as actually to end the war. Lee said repeatedly, and it's hard to tell whether he really believed it or if he sincerely believed it with all his heart, or if it's another one of these spin doctor type things. He said, Northern Army can't stay at Vicksburg during the summertime, the malaria will get them.
That was a common belief.
Yes.
Two things. One, a comment about this. There is a letter from Longstreet to Wigfall right after Longstreet got back to the Army. And he said, if we go into Pennsylvania, he'd gotten back and he'd had a chance to talk with Lee. And he wrote a letter to Senator Wigfall and he said, if we go into Pennsylvania, it may draw Grant off from Vicksburg. Which I read is he's got to pick that up from talking to Lee.
Right.
But the question I have for you, why did Davis take the biggest gamble of all, firing on Fort Sumter?
Well, that's a good question. Somebody had to do it.
Well, as long as the situation stayed as it was to the Confederacy's benefit.
Well, but no, I would argue with that from his point of view. Now, in general, I would tend to agree more with Toombs and what you said. I mean, in terms of physical, I mean, nobody's collecting a tariff, ships can come and go, you can function independently, and yeah, the thing to do, we can see in hindsight, was to declare that the guys out in the middle of the harbor are prisoners of war and send them rations. And declare Fort Sumter a Confederate prisoner of war camp. But say that you'd be glad to let the Yankees pull them out if they want their guys back, even though they don't have anybody to exchange with you, or something like that. But politically, there's this factor of, as Dan mentioned, the Confederate people wanting to strike a blow, of what it was Roger Pryor, the Virginia congressman there in Charleston, saying, "I'll tell you how to bring Virginia out of the Union in half an hour by Shrewsbury's clock. Strike a blow." And a lot of others saying things like that. Edmund Ruffin coming down from Virginia to enlist in the Palmetto Guards just so he could have the pleasure of pulling the lanyard on the first shot. They wanted to do that. I think Davis had to bear in mind that if he said, no, let it go, there was always the chance that the hotheads in South Carolina would slip the leash and the Confederacy would come apart before it was well underway. So, and then also, militarily, the attack on Fort Sumter, in strictly military terms. Political terms, it was a big risk, but in strictly military terms, the firing on Fort Sumter was a no-risk operation. Anderson and his men are not going to inflict a grave defeat on you. You're not going to lose large numbers of people. In fact, nobody got hurt until they fired the salute. So, a cannon burst and it killed the guy. But, so I think in the narrow way that Davis would look at it, he was very good at taking the narrow microcosm view of things and not the big picture view. This is a no-risk operation.
I'm sorry, I'll have to break off the conversation at that point, but thanks very much. Let's take a stretch